The atmosphere inside Le Papillon, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, buzzed with quiet efficiency. The polished marble floors reflected the warm, golden glow of the chandeliers, while the rich scent of butter, truffle, and slow-roasted lamb filled the air. Behind the kitchen doors, however, the atmosphere was far from serene. "Are you a complete imbecile, or do you just enjoy wasting my time?" Chef Antoine Moreau's voice sliced through the kitchen, like a knife through foie gras. His piercing glare was fixed on Elliot, a young culinary trainee whose hands trembled as he clutched a delicate porcelain plate, the edges of the sauce slightly smudged. Elliot swallowed hard, his throat dry. His face burned with humiliation as every eye in the kitchen turned to him. He had spent the past hour perfecting this dish, ensuring that the venison was tender, the wine reduction velvety, but a single misplaced smear had just ruined everything. I can fix it, chef," he stammered. Chef Moreau let out an exasperated laugh, shaking his head. "Fix it? Fix it?" He grabbed the plate from Elliot's hands and, with a sharp flick of his wrist, sent it crashing into the stainless steel counter. The impact sent the venison tumbling to the floor, the rich sauce splattering across Elliot's apron, like bloodstains on a crime scene. The entire kitchen went silent. Even the sous chefs and line cooks, who were used to Moreau's infamous outbursts, stood frozen, their knives hovering above cutting boards. No one dared to move. "You don't fix a mistake like that. You start over. Or better yet, you step out of my kitchen and never come back." Elliot clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but his voice wouldn't come. Instead, he lowered his head, willing himself not to let the tears forming in his eyes spill over. In the farthest corner of the dining room, seated at a discreet table near the window, a lone guest observed everything through the slightly ajar kitchen door. Dressed in a dark, well-tailored jacket, Johnny Depp lifted his glass of Bordeaux and took a slow sip, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. He had come to Le Papillon under strict anonymity, his presence known only to the restaurant's owner. The purpose of his visit? To experience the restaurant not as a celebrity, but as a critic. More precisely, as the potential investor who would decide whether Le Papillon was worth expanding into a global brand. What he had just witnessed, however, left a bitter taste in his mouth, one that no amount of fine wine could wash away. He placed his glass down carefully, brushing his fingers against his chin as he continued watching. There were many things one could forgive in a kitchen: delayed service, an overcooked fillet, even a slightly underseasoned dish. But abuse? That was something he simply couldn't stomach. Elliot's hand shook as he bent down to pick up the shattered porcelain. The sauce-stained venison lay in a pathetic heap on the tiled floor, its rich aroma now tainted with the sharp scent of humiliation. The kitchen remained eerily silent, the only sound being the distant clatter of utensils from the other stations, where the rest of the staff pretended not to notice the disaster unfolding in front of them. "Leave it!" Chef Moreau snapped, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've wasted enough of my time already." Elliot hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the broken plate. His entire body felt heady with shame, but he forced himself to straighten up. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, pity from some, silent judgment from others. Moreau exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "God help me. You're not just incompetent, you're slow too. Get back to your station before I change my mind and throw you out for good." Elliot turned quickly, blinking back the burning in his eyes. He could take the shouting, the insults. He had dealt with them before. But what made his stomach twist was the knowledge that he had just confirmed Moreau's opinion of him. Weak. Useless. A waste of space. His station was still a mess from before. The stainless steel counter was smeared with remnants of sauce. The herbs he had so carefully chopped now scattered across the cutting board. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself, but the heat rising to his face made it impossible to focus. Just as he reached for a fresh plate, a soft voice spoke behind him. "Hey, don't let him get to you." Elliot turned, startled. Julian, one of the sous chefs, stood beside him, his expression cautious. Unlike the others, who had quickly returned to their work to avoid Moreau's wrath, Julian had lingered watching. Elliot gave a stiff nod, swallowing the lump in his throat. I just, I should have been more careful. Julian shook his head. Moreau's an asshole to everyone. Don't take it personally. Elliot wanted to believe that, but it was hard when it felt so personal. He had worked his way into Le Papillon against the odds, beating out dozens of other applicants for a spot in the prestigious internship program. But now, standing here, he felt like he was barely holding on. Across the kitchen, Moreau clapped his hands sharply. Enough standing around. Service starts in 20 minutes, and I want perfection. Not whatever amateur disaster Elliot was about to serve. A few of the line cooks exchanged looks, but no one dared to laugh. Even those who might have enjoyed watching Elliot struggle knew that any one of them could be next. At that moment, the doors to the kitchen swung open, and Dominique, the maitre d', strode in. Tall, poised, and unfailingly professional, she carried an air of authority that even Moreau respected. She walked straight to the chef, lowering her voice, but Johnny Depp, still seated near the window, could just make out her words. Chef, one of our guests has requested to meet you personally after service. Moreau barely glanced at her, too preoccupied with barking new orders. Tell them I don't do meet and greets. Dominique's lips pressed into a thin line. I would, but I don't think you want to refuse this guest. For the first time, Moreau hesitated, glancing at her. Who is it? She leaned in, murmuring the name. Moreau's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His expression flickered from irritation to something closer to intrigue, perhaps even concern. Johnny Depp, still swirling his wine absently, pretended not to notice. From across the room, Elliot caught the brief change in Moreau's expression and frowned. He didn't know what was going on, but whatever it was, it had finally managed to shake the great Antoine Moreau. The tension in the kitchen didn't ease. If anything, it grew heavier, clinging to the air like the thick steam rising from the pots on the stoves. The usual rhythm of dinner service, orders flying, knives chopping, flames flickering beneath cast iron pans, continued, but there was a noticeable stiffness in the way the chefs moved, their shoulders slightly hunched, their eyes flickering toward Moreau whenever they thought he wasn't looking. Elliot kept his head down, trying to steady his hands as he plated a delicate lamb confit. His heart was still hammering from the earlier humiliation, but he forced himself to focus. If he let his nerves take over, he'd make another mistake, and he couldn't afford that. Not tonight. At the pass, Moreau stood with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning each plate before it left the kitchen. The maitre d', Dominique, had already left, but whatever she had whispered to him still weighed on his mind. He was tense, his usual arrogance tinged with something else, unease. Elliot had never seen Moreau rattled before. The chef was cruel, perfectionistic to the point of obsession, but he was always in control. Now, though, his movements were just a fraction too stiff, his responses a second too slow. Then, the inevitable happened. The moment Elliot had dreaded all night. As he reached for a squeeze bottle to garnish the plate, his finger slipped. A thin line of sauce splattered across the rim, just slightly off-center, but enough to make Moreau's sharp gaze snap toward him like a whip. For a split second, Elliot thought about wiping it away, fixing it before Moreau could react. But it was too late. The chef's voice cut through the kitchen. You really are determined to make my life miserable, aren't you? Elliot barely had time to step back before Moreau grabbed the plate off the counter and smashed it down, sending the lamb tumbling onto the stainless steel. Again, Moreau growled, voice low and dangerous. Do it again. The kitchen had frozen. Even the line cooks, who had learned to keep their heads down, were watching now. Elliot's breath came shallow and fast, his hands clenching at his sides. He wanted to say something, to stand up for himself. But his mind screamed at him to stay silent. Just survive the night. That had always been his strategy. Just survive the night. But tonight, someone else had a different plan. A slow clap echoed from the dining area. 1, 2, 3 deliberate, mocking beats. The entire kitchen turned toward the source of the sound. Johnny Depp, still seated in his secluded corner, was clapping. His expression was unreadable, half hidden behind the rim of his wine glass as he took a thoughtful sip. Then, he set the glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his dark eyes locking onto Moreau, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know," he said, his voice calm, almost amused, "I've been to some of the finest restaurants in the world." The entire room held its breath. Even Moreau hesitated. "And I have to say," Depp continued, "this is the first time I've seen a chef throw more food on the floor than he puts on the table." A single, stunned beat of silence. Then, a low murmur swept through the staff. Moreau's face darkened. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Johnny tilted his head slightly, as if debating whether to answer. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a gold-plated card. Dominique, who had just returned, saw it first. Her breath hitched. The restaurant's owner had given out only one of those cards. Moreau took a step forward, snatching it from Johnny's fingers. His eyes flicked over the text. His entire body went still. Elliot, watching from a station, caught just a glimpse of the lettering. Johnny Depp, independent investor and culinary critic. For the first time since Elliot had started working here, Moreau had nothing to say. The silence in the kitchen stretched so thick it felt suffocating. Moreau stood frozen, his fingers still gripping the gold-plated card, as if he could crush its meaning through sheer force of will. His eyes flicked from the embossed letters back to Johnny Depp, who remained completely at ease, watching him with a calm, unwavering stare. A bead of sweat rolled down Moreau's temple, though he would never acknowledge it. The kitchen staff, sensing that something monumental was happening, had completely stopped working. Even Dominique, usually composed and unreadable, stood at the edge of the room, her gaze flickering between the two men. Elliot, his pulse hammering, was still gripping the edge of his workstation, trying to process what was unfolding before him. Johnny finally broke the silence. "I imagine this isn't exactly the kind of performance you wanted to put on tonight, Chef." Moreau's jaw clenched. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but if you're looking for a free meal..." Johnny chuckled. A quiet, almost amused sound, but something about it sent a ripple of unease through the room. "A free meal?" He leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. "That's an interesting assumption. I wonder, do you think I need a free meal, or do you just assume that anyone questioning your methods must have ulterior motives?" Moreau's fingers twitched. "Because," Johnny continued, his voice still light, but carrying an unmistakable weight, "from what I saw tonight, I have every reason to question what's happening in this kitchen." He gestured lazily toward the counter, where the remnants of Elliot's ruined dish still sat, a mess of broken porcelain and wasted food. "You call yourself a chef, yet you destroy perfectly good dishes just to make a point?" Moreau exhaled sharply through his nose. "This is a professional kitchen, not a charity. I don't tolerate incompetence." Johnny took a slow sip of his wine before responding. "Oh, so it's incompetence, is it?" He set the glass down with deliberate care. "Tell me, then, do you find it incompetent when a trainee makes a small mistake? Or is it more incompetent when a head chef loses his temper so badly that he throws food onto the floor in the middle of service?" A murmur rippled through the kitchen. Moreau stiffened. His grip on the card tightened, his knuckles turning white. Johnny didn't move. He didn't need to. The weight of his words had already settled over the room, like a thick, suffocating fog. Moreau had spent years crafting his reputation, ensuring that every member of his staff feared and respected him in equal measure. He had survived harsh critics, difficult investors, and cutthroat competitors. But now, under the gaze of this man, he felt something unfamiliar clawing at his insides. Doubt. The realization made his stomach turn. Dominique cleared her throat. "Chef Moreau," she said carefully, her voice level, "perhaps we should discuss this in private." For a moment, Moreau didn't move. His pride was battling against the situation, but even he knew that refusing would only make things worse. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward his office, the heavy kitchen door swinging violently behind him. Dominique exhaled softly and gave Johnny a knowing look before following. Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were still trembling slightly, but now it wasn't from fear. It was something else. A feeling he hadn't experienced in this kitchen before. Hope. Johnny's voice pulled him from his thoughts. You should replate that dish, he said casually, taking another sip of his wine. I have a feeling you'll get a chance to serve it after all. Elliot blinked at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. And then, for the first time that night, Johnny Depp smiled. Elliot had never heard the kitchen so quiet. Even though the burner still flickered and the order still rolled in, there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of silence that came when something irreversible had just happened, a moment suspended in time, waiting for the next move. Moreau hadn't returned. The head chef had disappeared into his office, with Dominique closed behind, and the doors had remained shut ever since. The kitchen staff exchanged wary glances, but continued their work, their movements careful, as if afraid that one wrong step might shatter the fragile tension in the air. Elliot forced himself to keep going, meticulously plating a dish as if his life depended on it. Maybe, in some ways, it did. Across the dining room, Johnny Depp still sat in his corner, swirling his wine, watching everything unfold with quiet amusement. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed a man like Moreau unravel, but it was always fascinating to see how quickly the illusion of power could crack when challenged by the right words. Then, the doors to Moreau's office slammed open. Every head in the kitchen turned as the chef stormed out, his face flushed with barely contained fury. Dominique followed closely behind, her expression unreadable, but the way she held herself, shoulders squared, chin lifted, spoke volumes. Moreau's eyes landed on Johnny. You think you can walk in here and humiliate me? His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the kitchen like a blade. You think you know what it takes to run a place like this? Johnny tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, with practiced ease, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I think, he said, voice smooth as silk, that your biggest problem is that you've convinced yourself you're untouchable. Moreau's nostrils flared. You don't know a damn thing about me. Johnny gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. I know that every person in this room is terrified of you. I know that they work under the constant fear of being humiliated and berated. And I know that the only thing keeping your reputation intact is that nobody has ever dared to call you out before. A murmur rippled through the kitchen. Moreau clenched his fists. This is my restaurant. My kitchen. You don't get to tell me how to run it. Johnny's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Correction, it was your kitchen. Until about 10 minutes ago. Silence. Dominique finally stepped forward, clearing her throat. I've spoken to the owner, she announced, her voice calm, steady. Effective immediately, Chef Moreau is being placed on an indefinite leave of absence. The restaurant will be undergoing an internal review. A gasp broke from one of the lying cooks. Moreau whipped around to face her. You can't do that. Dominique met his glare without flinching. Actually, I can. Her voice softened, but only slightly. It's over, Antoine. You did this to yourself. Moreau stood there, shaking, his entire body rigid with rage. His eyes flickered to Elliot, then to the rest of the staff. No one spoke. No one defended him. And in that moment, he realized he had lost. With a sharp exhale, he ripped off his chef's jacket and threw it onto the counter. To hell with all of you! And then he was gone. The kitchen stood in stunned silence as the doors swung shut behind him. Elliot barely registered what had just happened. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. He looked down at the dish he had just plated, perfectly arranged, the sauce in its rightful place. He had survived. More than that, he had won. A quiet chuckle pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Johnny Depp watching him, an amused glint in his eyes. Well, Johnny said, lifting his wine glass, looks like you'll be needing a new head chef. A slow smile crept across Elliot's face. For the first time since stepping into this kitchen, he finally felt like he belonged. The kitchen felt different. It wasn't just the absence of Moreau, though that alone had shifted the entire atmosphere. It was something deeper, something more profound. For the first time since Elliot had started working here, there was air to breathe. No more second-guessing every move out of fear of being humiliated. No more terrified glances exchanged between cooks when a dish wasn't perfect. No more silence soaked in tension, waiting for the next explosion. Now, there was only the hum of service, the rhythmic chopping of knives, the sizzle of butter hitting hot pans. And for once, it felt like a kitchen, not a battlefield. Elliot was still trying to wrap his head around it. He moved on autopilot, his hands plating the final touches on a dish, his body still wired from the adrenaline of the past few hours. But beneath it all, there was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. A quiet clink of a wine glass snapped him out of his thoughts. Johnny Depp, still seated in his corner, had finished his meal. He pushed the empty plate slightly forward and gave Elliot a slow nod of approval. "Good work," he said, his voice smooth but sincere. Elliot wasn't sure if the man was talking about the dish or about everything else, but he nodded back nonetheless. The dining room had settled into a steady rhythm, guests oblivious to the chaos that had unraveled behind the scenes. Dominique moved through the floor with her usual efficiency, her face calm despite the storm she had just helped navigate. She stopped by Johnny's table, her lips curving into the faintest smirk. "So was it worth the trouble?" Johnny swirled the last of his wine in his glass before taking a final sip. "Let's just say, I've had more boring nights." She exhaled a soft laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment." He set the glass down and glanced toward the kitchen. "What's the plan now?" Dominique followed his gaze. The staff was still working, still moving, but they were different. Lighter. As if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "We adjust," she said simply. "We make this place better. No more fear, no more walking on eggshells. Just good food and respect." Johnny nodded, pleased. "Sounds like something I could invest in." Her eyes flickered with amusement. "I was hoping you'd say that." Elliot, overhearing the exchange, felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of this, whatever it was. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to belong. And for the first time, he believed he actually did.